So a little bit of accidental false advertising. I originally was going to smash two talks together and talk both about mom's employment and then also about the consequences for adolescent outcomes. As I made the slide, I realized that was many slides. So I'm going to focus today on the mom's employment part. I have the slides for the other part in backup, so if you're particularly interested in adolescent outcomes, I'm happy to talk about that at the end. The paper that I'll be talking about primarily is joint with Jolyn Joe, and the other paper is joint with Hope Harvey. They're both PhD students at Harvard. And just a kind of other housekeeping thing, my preference is to go ahead and do this, what I think of as sort of pop center style, which is to say in between the sociology, sit on your hands for 45 minutes, and the econ, the speaker never talks format. So somewhere kind of in between with sort of healthy dialogue back and forth is my preference. I'll pause to solicit questions periodically, but if you have them at any other time, clarifying or otherwise, I just think it's always more fun if we can be in conversation so I know kind of what you're interested in and what you want to hear more about and what's not making sense. Good? Okay. So as background that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, why should we care about mom's work patterns at all? Well, we know that transitioning from being childless to being a mom is associated with significant changes in women's work lives. Women exit the labor force. If they stay in, they reduce their work hours. And furthermore, we know that these changes are major contributors to the motherhood wage penalty. So that's the lower wages received by moms as compared to otherwise similar childless women. And it's not just the total number of hours you work that's a key contributor to that motherhood wage penalty. It's also the patterning of that work. So yes, your total labor market experience, but also whether your work is part-time or full-time, and also the number of interruptions you have going in and out of the labor market. So we care about mom's employment patterns in part because it contributes to within sex inequality for women, both between moms and non-moms and among moms, depending on which type of employment patterns they have. Of course, we also care about this because it contributes to between sex inequality. So the motherhood wage penalty is in turn a major contributor to the gender wage gap. So it's not surprising then that there's been a lot of sociological and economics and demography research on maternal employment. And I think broadly, the bulk of the literature falls into one of two camps. The first is to look at binary measures of point-in-time employment, whether a mom's working or not. And the literature in this group is often responding particularly to the dust-up in the early 2000s over this public claim that highly educated women in professional occupations were increasingly opting out to the labor force. So there was a little mini boom in sociology scholarship saying, no, that's not true. And so to do that kind of argument, folks are often relying on repeated cross-sectional data and just kind of looking at any given moment in time, what fraction of moms and which moms are working or not and how that's changing over time. The second, and I think even more common type of approach, is to focus on the years right around a birth, in particular right around a first birth, and to look at the timing of return to work or timing of exits and then return in that kind of narrow postpartum period. And this is typically done using event history models, and the focus is really on new mothers and the determinants of the speed at which they get back into the labor force. So that's a great way to study questions that pertain particularly to new mothers, for example, questions about breastfeeding and childcare policies and so on, but it kind of truncates the range of time we're looking at. Any questions, comments so far? Okay. So what are we going to do instead? Well, our goal is to start by describing mothers' long-term employment patterns. There's two pieces to this. One is just the long-term part. Rather than stopping the clock roughly 4 years after the birth, we're going to let that clock run longer all the way through the first 18 years of maternity. The basic idea here is just that women don't actually stop having the responsibilities of motherhood the minute that their kid turns age 5 and maybe starts going to school. We want to just look at what moms are doing even as they're mothers of older children. So that is not particularly, I think it's important, but it's not any major analytical shift. It's just letting the clock run. The more important analytical shift, though, is talking about patterns. So the previous research I was mentioning, there's kind of a quantitative focus on speed of return to employment. Is it faster or is it slower? And then also in some papers that look at total maternal experience, again, it's a kind of more or less analysis. And rather than picking a quantitative summary measure, that looks at a given moment in time or a single summary of overall experience, we're going to take the entire employment sequence as the unit of analysis and be sort of inductive in deriving common maternal employment patterns from that full sequence. So it's more of a bird's eye view of the entire pattern that women go through over almost 2 decades following the birth of their first child. So one of the ways that this pays dividends is, number one, you're not starting by imposing any assumptions about the typologies of women's work. 2, rather than just focusing on the average, it helps us to identify heterogeneity in what moms are doing, not just one pattern, but several common patterns. And then also to allow the fact that the patterns that emerge, differences between them may not always be well captured in a kind of quantitative hierarchical order. So you may have, for example, 2 women who end up at the end of 18 years with similar levels of work experience, but got there in different ways. After we go through and identify the patterns, the next step then is to say, well, what kind of moms end up in these different kinds of patterns? Our innovation here is not to think of some new independent variable that no one else has ever thought of. Rather, we want to say, well, given that we have these different, more qualitative outcomes, discrete outcomes for moms, how can that inform what we think we know about other commonly studied correlates of maternal employment? So just as 2 examples that have been highly studied, I'll use marriage first. The literature on how marriage and how husbands' characteristics are related to women's employment is pretty mixed. So in theory, you'd think, well, sure, married moms have other financial resources in the household, they should be working less. Compared to unmarried moms. And some people find that, but some don't find much association. Even among married moms, how high your husband's earnings are. Again, some people show that there is an effect, some people show not. And we think that possibly that the differences are being driven by different types of analytical strategies that end up privileging different types of maternal employment. So if we look at the whole distribution of common maternal employment patterns, maybe we'll find that what looks like mixed findings or what looks like a 0 is masking heterogeneity in for whom marital status matters and what kinds of patterns it encourages. So maybe marriage isn't monotonically associated with more or less work, but associated with particular types. And the same is true for race. So in general, if you look at women who were working prior to the birth of the first child, African American women compared to white women are less likely to exit the labor market. They reduce their work hours by less if they stay in, and if they do exit, they return to work more quickly. On the other hand, for unmarried moms, the pattern is reversed a little bit. For young moms, it's also a little bit different. So that could just be interaction terms. It could be that age cross race matters, but it could also be that race is associated again with particular types of patterns. So one recent article by Sarah Damask and Adrienne Fretch looks not at motherhood, but just at women's employment patterns in general, and they find that non-white moms, both African American and Hispanic, are concentrated at the poles. So they're more likely to have both very high levels of work experience and very low levels. So again, if we look at this in a more descriptive, qualitative fashion, we might be able to pull that out. We're not the first people to think about looking at long-term sequences across the life course. One of the areas in which this has been used is the study of careers. And so this kind of runs the gamut from looking at retirees and looking at their careers over the course of their lives, looking at women executives and their careers. And here the focus is often on job-to-job moves, not just time in and out of the labor market. There's also a set of research that is particularly concentrated among demographers who are looking at age-graded patterns of things like the transition to adulthood. So you might look, for example, at what's the ordering of leaving home, finishing school, getting married, and having a kid, and look at how those sequences differ across different folks. So it's not new to think about it in long-term perspective. But these prior studies have used age as the key marker. So thinking about the life course is primarily determined by age. So we're going to borrow their long-term, holistic, sequence-based focus, but then compared to or from the maternal employment pattern, keep that focus on the transition to maternity as a key point in women's life course. So in other words, we're going to peg everything to when you became a mom. If you became a mom at 15 versus 35, we're going to line it up by the first year that you were a mom. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I wondered, how do you deal with repeated pregnancies and repeated childbearing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's one of the biggest limitations of this type of method. It is not good for understanding time-varying covariates. Hazard models, you're modeling moment by moment by moment by moment. You can incorporate all those time-varying covariates. Here, the outcome is the pattern, and so we think of it as kind of forward-looking in the sense that if you could see a woman who's about to have a baby, what characteristics of her would predict her membership in these different employment patterns. So it's just a trade-off that you make in these different respects. You know, of course, the downside of the event history models is you focus only on one transition and you don't see the big picture. So absolutely, we view this approach not as better than event history models, but as answering a different kind of question. Yeah?
And relatedly, does it matter? So anchoring it at the motherhood,
yeah.
But when the motherhood, so for the accumulated, especially labor market experience, it won't matter. So I'm guessing that you can incorporate that age dimension.
Oh, for sure.
Even though you're anchoring it.
Correct, yeah. So we'll look at whether becoming a mom earlier versus later is associated with different types of patterns. We're not ignoring age, but the unit of time that things track out over is maternity. Yep. Other comments, questions? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to just move into the data because the data themselves are a little bit complicated. We're using data that I imagine is very familiar to many of you, data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth 1979 cohort. These are folks ages 14 to 22 who were first surveyed in 1979, and then they've been followed every year through 1994 and then every 2 years since then. So they're now in roughly their mid-50s. So we absolutely are not studying new moms, but we can't study new moms because the whole point is to look at the long-term pattern. From NLSY, we're going to use their weekly employment arrays to characterize women's employment in the first 216 months, 18 years, after their first birth. The NLSY constructs these weekly employment arrays based on detailed questions they ask about start and stop dates of all the jobs women hold during the survey period. And they also ask about start and stop dates of periods of non-employment. And then if you're working, they also ask about how many hours you're working per week. So who are we going to be studying? Well, our goal is to think about the long-term experiences of moms. So anybody that we are pretty sure remain childless, anybody we see through age 35 who never had a kid is out of our target population. And there are also a non-trivial number of moms who die, or women who die either childless or after having a child, but before the child turns 18. So we exclude these folks as not part of the target population. So this is not selection I think that you need to worry about. But there is some selection that you should be worried about. Of course, we have sample attrition going on through the NLSY's panel period. NLSY has done in general a very good job of keeping high rates of retention. They're over 70% through the current period. But we do lose about 12% of the sample, either folks who attrited before becoming moms but not yet at age 35, or people who attrited after becoming moms but the kid hadn't reached 18 yet. We also lose about 3% of the women in the sample because they had births too late for us to have 18 full years of maternal employment. So based on the fact that we want to have 18 years, we need them to have their births basically no later than 1996. The youngest women in the NLSY at that time are 31. So for this cohort, that's pretty old to become a first-time mom. So it's not a huge number, but it is a few moms that we're losing that way as well. For the moms we can keep, we have these weekly employment arrays from NLSY 79, and we use that to construct 9 different categories. Our original version did not have 9 categories, but the reviewers had some feelings about it. So we have now 4 different measures of intensity of employment. So if you're employed, we look at your hours. If it's 35 or more, you're full-time. If it's 20 to 34, you're part-time. Less than 20, we call that marginal employment. And then in a small number of cases, we know you're working, but we don't know the hours. You didn't report the hours, so we use that as an additional don't know status. If you're not working, in general, you're asked whether you're looking for work or not. So using that, we can distinguish between unemployed and out of the labor force. And then again, in a small number of cases, we know you're not working, but we don't know whether it's unemployed or out of labor force. In addition to asking about all your job start and stop dates, NLSY 79 also asks about within job gaps in work. So this does not measure things like paid employment or paid sick leave, but it's designed to measure kind of longer term absences from work while remaining connected to an employer. So this is exactly what we think maternity leave is. It's not clearly identified in the data, so we look at any of these within job gaps that either touch the month that the kid was born, that any kid was born, or that begin within 4 months afterwards. Weekly data is a lot to handle, so 52 weeks a year times 18 years. So to make things a little bit more analytically tractable, we collapse to monthly data using the modal status from the month. Questions, comments? Yeah.
A quick question
Yeah.
for the missing data.
Yeah.
Did you check, so if you were to change the outcome to the pattern instead of 18 years to 10 years, something like
Yeah.
that the early live period would include much more of the labors and that there weren't like anything surprising?
Great question. We did indeed. So we tried using 14 years. So 14 years, as you'll see in a minute, is kind of when things stabilize in terms of the patterns. And so when we restricted to 14 years, we're able to pick up more of the late moms, not all of them still, but more of them, and also some of the attritters, right? And so when we do that, yes, everything's stable. We only pick up a 6% increase in the sample size, so it's not so shocking that it's the same, but yes, it's the same. Anything else? Okay, so now what are we going to do to analyze these sequences? And right now we're stuck with 216-month employment sequences for every mom in the NLSY 79. We want to get to a point where we can say, these are common maternal employment patterns, and these are the moms who fall into each of those groups. So we have to get between these thousands of sequences to that outcome somehow. And to do that, we use a technique called optimal matching, which has been used in this career and life course literature as well. The simplest thing you can do if you want to understand which moms are similar to one another in terms of their employment patterns is just to line up two sequences next to each other and count the number of differences, right? So 216 months, if two moms are full-time in the first month, then they're a match, that's no score. If one's full-time, one's part-time the next month, that's a mismatch, so you'd give them a score of 1, and then just count up the discrepancies. So that's called the Hamming distance between any two sequences. People often don't like that simplified measure because they think, well, not all differences are equally different. So part-time versus full-time is more similar than out of labor force versus full-time. So we use a modified version that takes that into account. We assign different levels of dissimilarity based on basically how similar the work hours are. So out of labor force and unemployment, they're not the same, but we treat them as very similar. We treat them as more similar to marginal employment than to part-time, and so on and so forth. People have a lot of issues about cost matrices and how they're assigned in this kind of analysis. We've done 4 different cost matrices. I'm happy to talk about those results. It's like super important if you're into these methods, and it's super boring if you're not, so I'll skip it, and I'm happy to talk about it if any of you are into these kinds of methods and have questions. So now we have a dissimilarity matrix. So for every woman in the sample, we know her employment sequence, and we know how similar it is by our measure to every other woman in the sample. So now we have to get from there to putting people into groups. So we do that using clustering methods. We tried 3 different clustering methods to make sure that the results are robust, and also to pick a method that had good fit statistics. We end up using k-medoids, and the idea of this approach is it's a partitional approach, which means you start by telling it, I want 5 clusters. Now put these women into groups, into 5 groups, in a way that makes them internally most similar to one another, and then maximizes the disparity with all the other clusters. Of course, we didn't just choose 5 out of nowhere. We chose any number of clusters from 2 to 15, looked at fit statistics, and also looked at what changed when we added more or fewer clusters. So we didn't want to choose a number of solutions that would lead to something fragile in the sense of very small clusters, very sensitive to the sample. And so 5 is a good mix of robust fit statistics by several measures and interpretable and stable. I am not telling you that there are exactly 5 types of employment patterns, and that's the ideal types of what there is for US moms. You could obviously choose more or fewer, and I'm happy to talk about those results as well. Questions, comments? Once we have those 5 groups, then we're going to use multinomial logit models to examine the characteristics of moms that are associated with membership in these groups. It is a purely descriptive analysis in 2 senses. One, that it's not causal, but also in the sense that we don't have any strong hypotheses that we're testing here. We're focusing on inductively identifying from the data the characteristics that appear particularly predictive of membership in different groups. All the covariates that we use, alluding to your question, are pre-birth characteristics. And then for some, we lag them by a full year. So particularly for mom's work traits, we didn't want to use your work traits right before you gave birth because you may have been making accommodations for pregnancy for either medical reasons or in very near anticipation of the birth. So we go back at least a full year prior to the birth. We categorize the predictors in 4 broad domains. Human capital, the broad idea here from the economics literature in particular, is that the more human capital you have, the better your wage earning potential, the more you should work. We look at attitudes and cultural models. In general, when you have more traditional gender role attitudes, you should work less. We look at family experiences. This is back to the marriage stuff, but also age at first birth. And then we look at variation for white, African American, and Hispanic mothers. Everybody good? Okay. So now things get a little bit tricky, which is that we have this beautiful sample of most of the women in the NLSY 79 who became moms. But this is a cohort that had pretty early births. So the sample I've been talking about, this full set of moms, is what we call the extended sample. It's every mom that we can get our hands on that has 18 years of post-maternity data. The problem is about a quarter of them gave birth too soon for us to actually have the beginning of their employment sequence, and also too soon for us to measure those covariates in a pre-birth way. So we face a trade-off between using a more complete sample and having a smaller number of covariates versus using a smaller sample for which we have pre-birth characteristics. So we've done the models both ways. We've done the smaller set of covariates on both samples and then the larger set of covariates on just a smaller sample. The results are robust, except for in a couple of ways that I'll mention. And so I'm going to show you the results from this post-1979 sample. These are women who were interviewed in 1979 and didn't have their first birth until at least a year later. Fine. Okay. So what are the ways that we operationalize these different domains? For human capital, we're looking at your education in categories: less than high school, some college, more than college, and then also your pre-birth employment. Because again of when the NLSY 79 starts, we don't know your full employment history for all moms. So some of the moms were already 22 in 1979. They already had maybe been working for a while. So for everybody in this sample, we look at what you were doing in the 2 years before the birth. So one kind of includes pregnancy work, the other it should be a pre-pregnancy measure. We look at whether it was no work at all, part-time work, or full-time or more work in those 2 years. We have a bunch of measures of attitudes and what we think of as kind of cultural models you might be following for the type of work you're doing. We have your own mother's employment when you were 14 and your own mother's level of education. We have a measure of whether you said you wanted to be working at age 35, your report of what's an ideal number of children for a family, a scale of gender role traditionalism. The NLSY 79 asked 8 questions. We use 5 that load well together. And then we also have measures of your religious affiliation as well as the frequency of your religious attendance. For family experiences, we're just looking at your age at the first birth, whether you were a teenager in your early 20s, 20 to 25, or older, 26 and above. So again, this is a cohort characterized by relatively early marriage as well as fertility. And then lastly, for race, we look at whether you're white, African American, or Hispanic. Questions? You guys are making me slightly nervous by the lack of questions. You're fine? Okay. Well, we'll just proceed then. I'm also going to show you results from 2 separate subsamples for which we have some additional information. So if you're married, we also know your husband's work hours. We are particularly influenced by the work of Young Ju Cha and others thinking about overwork for men and the consequences for women. So we look at men less than full-time, or overwork 50 plus hours a week, as well as earnings. And then for moms who a year before the birth were working or who had been working in that year and reported information on the job, we have their hourly wages as well as the tenure that they had in their jobs. So we'll include those covariates for that subsample. So I want to show you, just for some context, aggregate pattern of how women's work changes in the years surrounding the transition to maternity. And this is not something that is unique to our sample at all. I just want to provide it so you have some sense of what's going on. So this big black group that you see at the bottom here, that's full-time employment. So you can see that full-time employment is just absolutely plummeting in the year prior to the birth, which is where we start, and then rebounds relatively quickly. About half of the loss comes back the next year. And then we have a very gradual slope up that's kind of continuous all the way through the kid's 18th birthday. So I think this shows two things. It shows, one, why you might want to focus on new mothers. There's a lot going on for new mothers. There's a lot of transitioning back to work and transitioning out of work pre-birth. But on the other hand, if you stop here, you miss quite a bit of the rebound that happens. So there also are a lot of transitions happening later on. For part-time work, this is the more intense part-time group, this is the marginal employment group. We also see declines in those prevalences leading up to the birth and then a rebound. But the rebound for those categories happens faster. So by a year after the kid's birth, those categories are pretty stable in size for the entire rest of the period. So they're drifting up here, but just because the full-time work is getting more and more common. So after the first year of birth, the major trade-off that you see happening is between full-time employment and non-employment. So non-employment is the salmon color, and it's eroding over this entire time. The spike of yellow that you see here, that's maternity leave. So lots of moms are on maternity leave at the time of the birth, unsurprisingly. And very few moms are on maternity leave a year after the birth, so less than 1%. And then you can see some additional maternity leave later. To your earlier question, this is probably subsequent children. The pink stripe at the top is unemployment. I was a little worried that we weren't going to be measuring the distinction between unemployment and out of the labor force very clearly, because this has been an issue in some prior research. So I'm somewhat relieved, I guess, to see that there's no big trends in the unemployed level. It's pretty stable throughout this entire period. This gray chunk at the top, this is for the biggest sample, and that's the missing data. So those are the early moms that we don't have their employment status right in the very early period. By the time we get to 4 years after the kid's birth, then we're down to less than 1% of missing. So the missing is really highly concentrated for early moms in early years. Yeah, good.
So great graph. I'm just trying to think about the consequences of the growing black area over time.
Sure.
So we're understating the eventual return to work. If we look at women 1 or 2 years post pregnancy, or post birth, are we overstating the effect of a maternity on?
Yeah, I mean, if you define maternity as everything after the birth, then yeah, we're overstating it, because a good chunk of those moms do go back pretty fast. And this is a statistic that I hear kind of thrown around, that the majority of moms who were working pre-birth are back to work within a year. And that's true, but some of those moms weren't working beforehand. Some moms were not working beforehand anyway, and a lot of moms that were working haven't gone back yet. So just because more than half do doesn't mean there isn't a long way left to go.
But on the other hand, again, I assume there's heterogeneity among the returners.
Stay tuned for the next slide,
And so the women who go back to work quickly are going to have the smaller wage penalty?
Yes.
And so,
yep.
So we're overstating a maternity in some respects and understating it.
Yes, this is a great point. I don't think this paper necessarily speaks to it, but there is, I think, an emerging concern that the motherhood wage penalty and how it's perceived to evolve over the child's life course is really bound up with the fact that you have the moms with the biggest wages disproportionately missing, biggest wage drops disproportionately missing in the early years because they're out of the labor market. So it's one of the concerns of trying to compare, for example, motherhood penalty estimates from NLSY 79 when we have moms for a long time, and the early estimates coming out of NLSY 97 where we're only able to estimate the wage penalty for the moms who went back to work relatively quickly because those moms are in their 30s now. Yep, I'd be worried about all the estimates. Anything else? Okay, so now let's see some heterogeneity. So these are the 5 clusters that emerge. I'll show you their prevalence on the next slide, but just to orient you a little bit, these are, again, the kind of prototypical sequences for each of the clusters. And you can see that 3 of them are real simple. The one on the top is moms who are basically continuing to work full-time. You can barely see it. They have one little sliver, 1 month of maternity leave, and then full-time in every single month that follows. The part-time group is just part-time the whole time. The non-employed group is non-employed the whole time. And then you get, as Jerry speculated, these 2 different types of return statuses. So in some ways, I think this return idea is what we think of as the typical mom employment pattern, drop out for a while and then go back. So the first thing to notice is just that, yes, that's a pattern, but we also have a number of groups of women who are doing very stable things for the entire period. We divide these 2 into the early return group and the late return group. So both of them are characterized by beginning in non-employment and then ending in full-time employment. The early return group, they're out for about 5.5 years before going back to full-time work. So I want to highlight that even there, that return to full-time work is happening later than when we usually stop the clock. So we usually stop the clock looking at mom's return to work at most 4 or so years post-birth. So we're missing the distinction between those early returners, late returners, and non-employed. If you stop the clock soon enough, you're grouping all these 3 together. A lot of prior work also has only looked at working, not working, which means that research often also misses the distinction between the top 2 groups, who are similar in terms of having quite consistent employment patterns, but accumulate wildly different amounts of labor market experience over the course of 18 years. So just a word now on the late returners. So you see, this sequence is the messiest of all of them, right? There's a lot going on here. This is the only group that we see have a little bit of unemployment here, a little bit of marginal employment, a little stripe of unemployed again, part-time, and then back to full-time. I would not stake a lot of money on this specific late return pattern. So as we go through different types of cost setting sequences, different weighting systems, we see the most kind of moving around of the specific medoid that's chosen for that late return group. So what I think you can be confident of is that we are identifying a group that spends a decade or so completely out of work and then goes back. Whether that unemployment stripe appears or not, that I think is a little more unstable.
Can you tell us how big those groups are?
Yep. So one thing I think is especially important to do here is compare, as we go into the multivariate results coming up next, to think about what's changing as we're excluding those younger births. So the moms who are in the full sample, the extended sample, all the births, they are, of course, younger on average at the first birth. They also are disproportionately less educated. In terms of the distribution of the groups, I think we can see that cutting off those very youngest moms does a little bit to shift us more towards the more full-time group and a little bit to shift us away from the non-employed, but there's nothing so radically different here that I think we have to be ultra concerned. So perhaps not surprisingly, these kind of bifurcated groups are the most common groups. We have a little over a third who are in the full-time, and then a fifth to a quarter that are in the non-employed group, and then the rest are all doing something in between. And so I think it's these something in between patterns that our models are particularly well suited to identifying. Prior research often says, well, there's some moms who work a lot, and there's some moms who really don't work a lot, and then there's this middle group. And that middle group is sometimes called adaptive, pulled back, transitional, intermittent. And one thing I think is exciting about what we're able to do is we're able to say, okay, but those moms actually are not doing the same thing. Working part-time in every single year is not the same as spending 8 years out of the labor market and then working full-time. And 2, as we're going to see in a minute, they're not the same moms. And so I think having that ability to pull apart distinctions is important for us. If you were to collapse this to 4 clusters instead of 5, you'd merge those 2 return groups. If you were to make it 6 clusters, you'd generate a third return group. So that's one of the reasons that we chose to stop at 5, is most of the increasing differentiation is just picking apart exactly when she goes back between those 2 periods. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure there's a lack of movement between full-time and part-time. Can you remind us how exactly you're capturing it?
Sure. Part-time is 20 to 34. Marginal is less than 20.
And you're using the model at the month level?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so this, I think, transitions well to the next slide. This is the actual set of all the sequences that go into the early returners group. And so I think it's important to keep in mind, I do think those medoids are capturing important differences across groups, and I'll show you that slide in a minute, but it's not the case that like no moms are doing moving around. So the medoid sequence is she's out and then she's in full time. So that you see that, right? You see that in the salmon on the left and the black on the right, but you can also see there is a lot of part-time going on here for these moms. So of course, when you try to reduce the dimensionality from thousands of sequences to these 5 medoids, we're missing a lot of the internal variation. So that's just to be transparent about kind of keeping in mind that there's within cluster heterogeneity as well. But nonetheless, we do see the kinds of average differences across these groups that we'd expect. So on average, the full-time group is spending 80% of their months in full-time labor. The kind of flip side is true for the non-employed group. They're spending 3/4 of their time out of the labor force. I want to just call your attention to, again, these more heterogeneous groups in the middle. So the part-time group, even though their medoid sequence is part-time in every single month, compared to the most extreme groups, they're a little bit more mixed in terms of what they're doing. So compared to other clusters, you see much more blue for them than you see for the other clusters. They are distinctive in that respect, but they only spend 57% of their time in these marginal or part-time statuses. So they do also, on average, have some time in the more extreme statuses. The early and late returners obviously kind of fall in the middle, not so much time in part-time, and then different in terms of how much time they're spending non-employed versus full-time. Okay, so now I'm going to, no numbers at all, but just kind of walk you through the characteristics that are particularly strongly associated with membership in these different clusters. I'm going to show them to you in categories across those different domains. So this is the results for the human capital measures. That's education as well as prior work experience. The thing that stands out most strongly is that the non-employed group, the consistent non-employed, is characterized by the very lowest levels of human capital. So moms who lack a high school degree are overrepresented in this consistent disconnection from the labor market. The moms who work part-time have the highest levels of human capital, particularly having more than a college degree. Having some advanced graduate training is associated with heightened odds of membership in that group. And then the early returners are characterized not by having low education, but they're particularly likely to lack a college degree. So they're kind of a moderate education group. In terms of what you were doing before you became pregnant and during pregnancy, the full-time moms stand out by far from the rest here. So not surprisingly, the women who were working a lot before they had the kid continue to work a lot after the kid. In terms of race, we see consistent with that result I mentioned earlier that non-white moms are concentrated in the more extreme statuses. For Hispanics, they're concentrated both at the low end and at the high end. For African Americans, it's just a higher likelihood of membership in the full-time group. And then these more intermediate groups, particularly part-time status, are really distinctive of white moms. So we see, as expected, a kind of non-monotone association there. It's not just marriage means more or less work. It's a kind of concentration of white moms in the middle categories. In terms of family, we see again the same kind of non-monotone pattern. The married moms are concentrated in the middle. The unmarried moms are concentrated at the edges. And then a different pattern yet again for age. So the full-time moms and the early return moms, the moms who go back after about 6 years, they are most likely to be teen mothers, whereas the other moms tend to be older, particularly both the part-time and the late return group. In terms of those attitudes and other kinds of background correlates, for the full-time group, having your own mom have worked when you were in your teen years is a strong distinguisher of that group relative to all the rest. So that full-time group is characterized not only by strong pre-maternity labor experience of their own, but also by a family history of work for their moms. Somewhat surprisingly to me, the non-employed group is the most likely to have a mom who was more educated. So even though these moms themselves often have low education, they come from, on average, more privileged backgrounds in terms of their mom's education. And the part-time group is less so, but is unlikely to have a very low educated mom. There's a couple measures of attitudes that don't do much here. So how many kids you think is ideal for a family, whether you say you want to work at age 35 or not, those things don't matter at all. having traditional gender role attitudes only distinguishes the non-employed group from the rest. So yes, the attitudes are doing something here, but they're not particularly distinguishing between, for example, the high full-time moms and all the other intermediate groups. They only distinguish the last group. The part-time moms is one of my favorite results because I think it's sort of bizarre, is that the part-time moms are also characterized by the lowest levels of religious attendance. These moms are more likely to not go to church or other religious services even monthly compared to all the other clusters. So they're not particularly traditional in their gender role attitudes, but they do have this disaffiliation from religious organizations. Members of other religions, that is to say not Catholic, not Protestant, and not no religion, so members of a religion but just something else, are more concentrated in these two last groups. So that group is kind of a hodgepodge of folks. I don't want to make too much of interpreting this because it includes both folks who are members of minority religions like Jews, but also folks who give religious answers that can't be well categorized as either Catholic or Protestant, but may actually be Christian also. In the married sample, this is one of the, I think, least surprising patterns. We find that if you have a husband who doesn't make too much money, you're more likely to be in the full-time group, whereas those who have husbands who make more are concentrated in both part-time and the significant periods out of the labor market. And then last, in the working variables, those non-employed moms have the lowest job tenure compared to everybody else, and the early returners have the lowest wage. All right, so that's kind of going through things as a row by row by row level. Now I want to step back to kind of look at it by column and say, like, what have we learned here about kind of the patterns that we see? So one thing I want to start with is looking at where the particularly advantaged moms are. And I think by measures of both economic advantage and also kind of advantageous family structures, we see moms clustered in both the late return group and in the part-time group. And the part-time group, I think, even more so. So these moms are disproportionately white, married, older at the time of the first birth, and they also, if they're married, have higher spousal earnings. Yeah, go ahead.
Aren't they also in the non-employed? And the non-employed seems to me to be an admix of two groups, and that there seem to be tons of, I mean, I don't know how many there are, but the cluster at the bottom describes people who can afford not to be involved.
Yep, so I just wasn't there yet, but yes, you're absolutely right. So the part-time and the late return, I think, are kind of unambiguously highly advantaged groups. And what I want to note there is that depending on kind of when you looked and how you looked, you might have thought of these women as kind of the opt-out group because they're highly educated themselves and have high-earning husbands and are married and so forth. I absolutely agree with you that the non-employed group is a mix. And sometimes people say, well, doesn't that mean your clustering solution failed? Well, no. These women look identical from the perspective of their employment patterns. They just got there for different reasons, right? And so as Herb is mentioning, it just kind of it happens the way I stack the covariates, but you can see on the one hand they're characterized by low levels of human capital, less than a high school degree, low job tenure, didn't work that much prior to the birth, more likely to be unmarried, more likely to be Hispanic relative to white or African American. Those all sound like measures of can't work or unable to get and keep a job. Whereas then other aspects sound like choose not to work, like high spousal earnings, advantageous social origins, traditional gender roles, and so on. So I absolutely agree with you. It's just a hodgepodge mix. What I think is important about identifying that these women aren't all highly privileged is that when we talk about stay-at-home moms, I think we often think of the privileged group and not think about the other group so much. So stay-at-home moms are more likely to be in poverty than working moms. That's obvious if you focus on the working versus not working part, but as soon as you say stay-at-home mom, I think we start thinking of the more privileged groups and not thinking about some of the other reasons. A group that I think emerges quite clearly here is these early returns. So remember, the characteristic of them is out for about 5 years and then back to full-time work. And I think of these folks as kind of early family formation, delayed career. So they are likely married, even though they're having their births relatively early. They're not super disadvantaged, but nor do they have college degrees. And they have particularly low wages. So foregoing some of the work experience during the years their children are young, maybe not particularly high opportunity cost, but they also, by comparison, don't have particularly high-earning husbands, so they do get back into the labor market. They are contributing financially. They are able to hold jobs, but they kind of delay that process of having a career. And then lastly, the full-time group I think of as women who may need to work but can work. So again, they have high levels of work experience, both in their family and for themselves. They are more economically precarious in terms of being more likely to be young when they have a first birth, more likely to be unmarried, more likely to be non-white, more likely if they are married to have low spouse earnings, but yet, even if it's by necessity, they do achieve high levels of employment. Any questions? But yeah, go ahead.
No. How is this related to family size and number of children?
Great, yeah.
Full time is just
no, it's
one child, or?
Yeah, no. So there is. This goes back to your question from the very beginning. There is variation here, ranging from about 2 children on average for the full-time group, up to 2.8 for the non-employed group, and then these are in the 2.2 to 2.5 range. So, it's endogenous, right? Do they have more kids because they're not working? We don't know. But you do see the kind of expected differences. But I think it's important that, unlike perhaps later cohorts, even the moms who are working full-time are averaging 2 kids. Yeah.
Did you look at the cost of childcare for these in terms of?
Great question. No, that data are just not available in a clear way for the NLS Y79 data. And it's a great point because absolutely not just the cost of childcare, but access to it, the distribution of childcare centers and stuff has been identified in other work as particularly important for new moms' employment.
I wondered if you thought about calling this non-employed category like moms with kids, or you don't want to call it stay at home because of the opt-out, but it seems like what you're trying to capture is moms taking care of kids.
Right. Yeah. Sure. Mom. So there's like this tinge of normative stuff that I think we never want to say these moms are not working. Right? And so it's a little bit of nor do we want to say that moms who are employed full-time are not full-time moms, right? So yeah, I'm open to suggestions, but also I never want to imply anything about judgment about whether these moms are good moms or not working or whatever. Yes, please.
One big area of controversy recently is why aren't men and women equally represented sort of in the upper echelon of high-powered sectors like STEM and tech and corporations. It sounds like your story has a simple, kind of straightforward numerical explanation for why we shouldn't expect that.
So I think it's certainly true that women accumulate less labor market experience, and that contributes to, as I said, the kind of big gender wage gaps on average. I also think
wages. I just mean at the upper levels, that there are going to be more men than women at the upper levels of these jobs because of the patterns of semi-opt-out.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I also think that even within, when people condition samples to be samples of men and women who both went gung-ho full-time all the time, we still see men rise through the ranks more quickly. So I don't think that it's the only explanation, but I do think that there are women who are taking significant time out, and that has implications at the top as well as at the bottom. Other comments, questions? I'm just about done, so I can wrap up here. So what do I think we've learned? And what are the implications for other people who want to just study maternal employment? I think it's important to let the clock run longer. This is a decision you can make that doesn't have any necessary implications for your analytic strategy. You can keep using event history models, you can incorporate your time-varying covariates. You may think that the processes in the first year are different from the processes in the later year. That's fine, but when available, we can just run the clock out. And that, again, if we don't do that, we miss distinctions among these 3 groups, which are, number one, a large fraction of moms, but also, as described, a pretty different set of women. So the early returners are not particularly advantaged. They're the kind of early family formation. The late returners are relatively advantaged. The non-employed are bifurcated. So these are different categories that we miss if we stop the clock. Also, I think it's somewhat surprising to me how little attention has been paid in the literature to part-time versus full-time work. There is scholarship that does that, but it's not consistent. And so, again, focusing only on that binary for work misses the distinction between part-time and full-time. These moms have very different work experience. They're also, as we saw, moms who are characterized in quite different ways, with the part-time moms being typically advantaged in not only their own human capital, but also their family experiences and their family resources. The full-time moms being characterized by high levels of work for themselves, pre-birth, post-birth, but maybe more financial need. And then last, I think something that comes out that we saw is the patterns for work and how it relates to key predictors like your age at the first birth, race, and marriage are not necessarily in some kind of monotonic progression, nor are they all in the same way. So race and marriage sort of operate the same way, that married moms and white moms are pushed towards those middle groups. But age, we saw something different, which is the full-time moms and the early returners are the youngest, and then the other three are older. So there's a lot of complex patterns here that I think we miss if we just treat everything as faster return, slower return, or more total paid work, less total paid work. And then lastly, I think it's important, even if you're using an event history model approach, which is fine, answers different questions, to think about the given transition that you're looking at as embedded in a larger trajectory. And so you can, for example, look at whether this pattern of transitioning might be different for moms who already spend a lot of time in part-time work. That might suggest they're in the consistent part-time group versus moms who are currently part-time but previously were out of the labor force for a long time. Those moms are different and they may have different subsequent transitions as well. So that's all for me, except I have those kids' outcomes if you want to see them.
So that was great, thank you. One is about, did you get a chance of, these things have been changing really quickly, maybe less so since the 90s or a little bit before that, but you're starting to capture births basically from the 80s to 96, right? Did you get a chance of actually checking if there was any change over time?
Right, so yeah, we really can't, and there's a good limitation to highlight that what I'm calling age is pretty highly correlated with period here. And so, we do have some variation in the birth cohorts, so 14 to 22 at the start, but when we start even just doing minor cuts to it, we get, plus we have the 5 categories, so even 2 age groups cross 2 periods, cross 5, we just get some really small cells. So I think it's a good point that, that we can't really speak to that very well, yeah.
And the other question that I had was related to the covariate. So a lot of the literature in mother's employment focuses on the occupational level or the firm level environment and how that encourages or discourages if you want to stay or not, and different kinds of things. So do you have some of that information?
Yeah, so I think we don't have the right covariate. So when this paper began, I thought, oh, my contribution is going to be these occupational characteristics. And so I did have all these clever covariates. And so we used percent female in your occupation, percent part-time in your occupation, percent overwork in your occupation, as well as average wages. And also we kind of did a like APROX Mincer curve to look at returns to each additional year of experience, because an original hypothesis was, well, maybe the moms who have been kind of the focus of a lot of qualitative work, these high achieving moms, maybe they're in firms and occupations where taking time off is a huge penalty, right? You just really go off into a separate mommy track. And so maybe those women are going to bifurcate, like we see some other characteristics. Either they stay all in or they're just out. None of those characteristics mattered one bit, nothing, right? And so I think you might say, well, you didn't really have the right measures, right? So that really we want something more about workplace culture or something like that, or something about the individual job. Is your supervisor supportive? We just don't have those things. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
Patterns, I mean, you show differences by whether the kid was born to a young mom or an older mom. So like for the employment categories, if you are 15 when you have a kid, you're not going to be in a high-powered job before you have the kid. So, age and at the time of the birth and your education sort of gets funnily mixed in here. Because we know that having a birth at a young age influences whether you finish school, or at least it's associated with it, whether it's causal or not. It's debatable. And the other thing I was wondering is divorce. You said something about number of kids in those different categories, but divorce also has a big impact. And whether that varies by the age of the first birth, probably.
Let me take the second question first. So we did the same kind of thing with marital long-term outcomes that we did with kids, which is to say we don't want to include it because it's endogenous, but we did want to look descriptively at how are they different. And it actually lines up pretty well with what you see just in the pre-birth experience. So these characteristics are characterized, these clusters are characterized by more proportional time of their lives spent married also. your other question about how everything is kind of bound up together, you're right. And all we do is kind of your standard multivariate models. There are places where we think it's getting, like with age and period, where we think, whoa, this is just too closely correlated. We can't tell. One thing that I think is good about the models that use wage and tenure is that here we're restricting the sample at least to women who had a job, right? And so anybody who got pregnant in high school, for example, we're probably not going to be counting them here. But you're absolutely right that there could be aspects of the correlation among the predictors that aren't being well captured by our multinomial logit. Yeah.
So you've got a sizable group of women that are not in your analysis, the women
Yeah.
who never had a birth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Have you thought about ways of incorporating them by matching, for example, on the age of women at which women did have a first birth?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't think it'll fit in this project, but I'm curious in general about I guess my interest in childless women is partly about the changing composition of childless women over time. And so here, the childless women are a pretty distinctive group, just as are, for example, people who never married. Whereas with childlessness increasing over the period, I think looking at cohort trends would be interesting. So no, we didn't use them here. The women who stay childless are, again, kind of an admixture, as Herb said, of women who are low and high. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, and then.
Go ahead.
Okay.
No. I just wanted to hear what you think this says about racial and ethnic inequality in the labor market. Because, the motherhood penalty, the discussion of the motherhood penalty, pushing women out of the labor market, but really that has been a white women experience for the full-time working mother actually is a minority woman. I mean, I'm thinking about the implications of this analysis, or the broader discussion, what the motherhood penalty who have they been focusing on?
It's a great question. I think that this opt-out piece just did, in ways, I think it did a lot of damage to the trajectory of this research because scholars had to work so hard to say, no, there is no opt-out revolution. But because that debate was all focused on at least highly educated moms, often married moms, and in some analyses, even quantitative analyses, sometimes just white moms, that I think, as you said, our view of what maternity does, what maternal employment is like, and partly because of looking at only subsamples and partly because of whites' dominance in the distribution, we really have described a lot about white moms' experiences and not so much about African American and Hispanic moms. I think Sarah Damaski's I don't know how to say her last name. Damaski, thank you. Sarah Damaski's qualitative book that looks at this wide distribution of moms, including variation by race and ethnicity and education, I think is an incredibly powerful way to bring in the experiences of those women. And I agree with you that not only is this kind of pulled back intermediate pattern really typical for white moms, particularly the part-time status, also there are some interactions here which I didn't talk about, but for example, the interaction between marriage and employment is much stronger for white women than it is for anybody else. So African American women, whether they're full-time or whether they're non-employed, tend to stay there or tend to be there independent of marital status, whereas that's not true for white women. So I do think absolutely that the stories we tell ourselves are dominated by what we think we know about white women. Yeah.
Sasha, thanks so much.
Okay, sure, yeah, you're welcome.
I was curious